Cowboy, if you want to marry our sister, then by sacred law you must satisfy the sisters first. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The last stretch of sunlight hung low across Red Willow Basin as the evening pushed shadows across the land, giving the tall grass a dull golden tone while the cold air settled in fast. Grant Hale rode along a narrow ridge on his bay horse, his breath visible each time he exhaled. He kept one hand on the reins and the other resting near the worn holster at his hip, not out of paranoia, but habit built from years of drifting across territories where help rarely arrived in time. At 38, Grant carried the look of a man shaped by long roads and rough decisions. Faded scars crossed his jawline. The edges of his short brown hair had begun to gray, and the lines around his eyes came from more lonely nights than he cared to remember. He wasn't on any job tonight. He wasn't chasing anyone, and no one was expecting him. He had ridden into these foothills because he preferred the distance, and because a few days earlier he had seen smoke rising from this direction and wanted to know if it belonged to settlers who might need help or drifters who meant trouble. Grant had spent most of his adulthood fixing things other men broke: fences, wagon axles, peace between neighbors, and sometimes bones, without ever staying long enough for anyone to thank him properly. He had never tried to build a place of his own, not after losing the small life he once had, one he didn't talk about with anyone. As Grant guided his horse down the slope, his eye caught a thin, uneven column of smoke rising from the base of a collapsed structure. The fire looked small and close to dying, the kind someone might start in desperation rather than comfort. He slowed his horse, scanning the ground for fresh tracks. The dirt showed impressions of feet, but they were scattered and messy, as though someone had been running or dragged. His pulse tightened a little, the way it always did when he sensed something had gone wrong. He dismounted and let the horse follow loosely behind. Each step he took toward the ruins of the shelter was measured and quiet. He had learned the hard way never to rush into unknown corners. The building had once been a simple hunting shack, but the roof had caved in and the supporting beams rested at jagged angles. A section of canvas sheet hung from a nail, torn in two, flapping weakly in the cold breeze. Grant checked the perimeter first, studying the grass for anything he could use. No horses, no discarded belongings, no bodies. Then he saw a hand. It lay still beside a fallen log, fingers curled slightly as if they had closed around something before giving up. Grant stepped toward it quickly but carefully, brushing aside a patch of brush. A young Apache woman lay partly covered by a worn blanket, her body twisted in a way that showed she had tried to crawl away before collapsing. She was breathing, but only barely, her chest rising in short, shaky draws. Her long black hair was tangled, the feathers woven into it bent out of shape. Her bronze skin had gone pale under the cold, and blood had dried along the torn section of her deerskin dress. Grant knelt beside her and felt a jolt of concern run through him. He hated the sight of someone suffering alone, especially someone this young. She opened her eyes when he touched the blanket near her shoulder, and fear flared across her face instantly. Her muscles tensed as though she expected to be grabbed or hit. Grant raised both palms in front of her slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly. Her breath trembled, but she didn't look away. She tried to push herself up, but pain shot through her side, forcing her back down with a tight gasp she tried to hide. Grant spoke again, softer than before. "Let me help you." He slid his arms under her with steady hands, feeling how light she was and how her body shook from cold and blood loss. Her fingers clutched at his coat before she pulled them back quickly, ashamed of the instinct. He didn't comment, didn't try to comfort her with words she might not trust. He carried her to his horse, lifted her onto the saddle, and wrapped her in a spare blanket he usually kept for freezing nights. When she sagged forward, he steadied her with one arm, then mounted behind her. He rode toward a small line cabin he knew miners had used years ago. Grant had passed it many times, but never slept there. He preferred being outdoors. Tonight, the woman needed a roof, heat, and clean bandages more than anything. The cabin stood nestled in a shallow pocket between two slabs of stone. The door creaked loudly as Grant shoved it open with his shoulder. Inside, the place was rough but usable. A cot on the left wall, a small table with a warped surface, a few crates stacked near the far corner, and a stone hearth with old ashes still clinging to the edges. He carried the woman inside and laid her gently on the cot. She tried to push herself upright again, stubbornly refusing to appear weak, but the pain overwhelmed her and she sank back, her jaw tightening in silent frustration. Grant filled a tin bowl with water from his canteen and tore strips from the spare shirt he kept in his saddlebag. When he moved the blanket aside to check her injury, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes burning with a warning he understood clearly. "No wrong touch," she whispered, her voice raw. Grant didn't pull his arm free. He simply looked at her, meeting her gaze without blinking. "I'm cleaning the wound. That's it." She held on for a moment longer, her breathing rapid from fear and exhaustion, then released him slowly. Grant worked carefully, washing the dried blood away and inspecting the cut along her ribs. It had been made by something sharp, likely a knife or jagged metal. She winced as the cold water touched her skin, and her hand trembled while she gripped the edge of the cot. He wrapped her wound with firm precision until the bleeding stopped. When he pulled the blanket back over her, her body loosened slightly, as if the warmth had reached her bones. "My name is Tolly," she whispered, her voice steadier now. "Grant," he answered. She studied him in the dim firelight, trying to read the man who had carried her from the dirt. "You travel alone?" "Most days," he replied, his expression unreadable. "Why stop for me?" There was suspicion behind her question, but also the quiet hope of someone who wanted to believe she wasn't at the mercy of another merciless man. Grant thought for a moment before responding. "You were hurt. That's reason enough." Tolly listened to the crackle of the fire, her eyes half open, watching how he moved. He wasn't restless. He wasn't nervous. He didn't stare at her the way some men did when they found a woman alone. He checked the room once, then sat in the chair beside her cot, elbows resting on his knees, as if prepared to stay awake as long as needed. He added another small detail that eased her fear. "I'll stay right here. If anyone tries to come in, I'll hear them first." Her breathing steadied piece by piece, not because she trusted him yet, but because she could see he wasn't hiding his intentions. Grant didn't know what had happened to her, but he could tell by the bruises on her arm and the frantic look she carried that she was running from something dangerous. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. She needed sleep before anything else. As night thickened around the cabin, Tolly drifted off with the stiffness of someone who hadn't slept safely in many nights. Grant remained awake, listening to the wind outside, alert to every sound. He didn't know who might be looking for her, but he assumed someone would be. People didn't just collapse in the dirt without reason. He glanced at her once more. Her breathing had settled into a slow rhythm. She looked young, far too young to be carrying the kind of fear he had seen in her eyes. Grant stayed in the chair until dawn, never letting himself close his eyes. Years of bad nights had taught him that danger rarely waited for sunrise. He didn't know that in a few minutes, when the door opened and two Apache women stepped inside, one tall and stern, the other smaller but sharp-eyed, his life would shift in a direction he hadn't prepared himself for, and the quiet routine he had built would no longer belong solely to him. The door pushed inward with a sudden draft that cut through the warm cabin air, and Grant lifted his head from his steady watch over the cot the moment two figures stepped inside. Both women froze when they saw him. Their eyes went directly to Tolly, then to the bandages wrapped around her ribs, then back to Grant with expressions that carried suspicion, fear, and something heavier beneath it: responsibility. The taller one, broad-shouldered with a bone necklace resting against her deerskin dress, stood in front as though shielding the younger sister behind her. The smaller woman, quicker in her movements, scanned every corner of the cabin, her gaze sharp enough to catch the faintest detail. Neither spoke at first. Grant rose from the chair slowly, showing his hands so they could see he held nothing. He had expected someone to come, but he hadn't known how soon or in what state. He stepped back to give them room, watching as the older sister moved to the cot. Her features tightened with relief when she confirmed Tali was breathing evenly. She touched Tali's hair gently, brushing a few strands from her face with a care that suggested she had been terrified of finding something far worse inside the shelter ruins. Tali stirred as she sensed a familiar presence. Her eyes opened halfway, still heavy with exhaustion. "Asha," she whispered. The older sister's expression softened, but only for Tali. She turned back to Grant with her posture rigid, her voice controlled but firm. "You touch her?" Grant nodded once, only to stop the bleeding. The younger sister moved closer, her curiosity overriding her fear. She looked at the cloth strips, the carefully tied knots, the clean water bowl, the chair pulled near the cot. She watched Grant in a way that didn't accuse, but calculated. Her voice carried a quicker rhythm. "You were alone with her all night?" "Yeah," Grant answered quietly. She was fading fast. The sisters exchanged a silent look, one full of tension and unspoken questions. They hadn't expected to find their youngest sibling alive, let alone tended to by a stranger, and certainly not by a white cowboy wearing a worn coat and dust-coated boots who looked like he had seen more wounded souls than he cared to admit. Asha finally broke the silence. "Why help her?" Grant hesitated for the first time since they entered. Not because he feared the question, but because he realized he hadn't thought about how to explain his instinct. He scratched the back of his neck, eyes lowering slightly. She was hurt bad. No one else around. Leaving her didn't seem right. The more inquisitive sister stepped closer. "Many men leave, or do worse." "I'm not that kind," Grant replied, voice steady. The younger sister studied him for a few seconds longer, then turned her attention back to Tali. She rested a hand on Tali's uninjured arm, and Tali's fingers closed around hers weakly, grounding both of them. Grant saw how protective they were, and how relief mixed with fear in their expressions. He understood that whatever had happened to Tali wasn't simple, and he realized he needed answers he hadn't pressed her for the previous night. But the sisters spoke first. Asha lifted her chin with a seriousness that filled the small room. She refused marriage. They called her unclaimed. They sent men after her. This explained the ragged tracks near the shelter, the torn feathers, the wound that looked like it came from a blade swung in frustration or punishment. Grant tightened his jaw, feeling anger rise, controlled but sharp. He had seen groups take their frustration out on women before, and it never sat well with him. He shifted his weight slightly, steady but ready. The younger sister, Nomi, stepped around the cot and positioned herself near the fire. "They want to bring her back. Not for good reason." Grant looked from one sister to the other. "They close?" Nomi nodded once. "Not far. They searched last night." That explained the feeling he had sensed in the darkness outside. Grant had stayed awake, but he hadn't known how near the danger had been. Now it was clear someone had tracked Tali until she collapsed, and they might still be following her trail. Asha lowered herself to sit beside Tali, her hand brushing gently across the blanket as though confirming again that her sister was real and alive. Then she faced Grant with a seriousness he recognized from people forced into impossible decisions. "You saved her life." Asha's voice held weight, not gratitude, but a statement of fact. "Our law says something for that." Grant didn't speak. He had lived near enough Apache and other tribes to know customs varied, sometimes in ways a man needed to step carefully around. He waited. Asha continued. "A man who keeps a woman alive after she has been cast out becomes her protector. If he wants to marry her, he must first earn approval from her sisters." Grant stiffened slightly, not in fear, but in surprise. Across the firelight, Nomi watched him closely, almost studying how he reacted to the announcement. Grant's face didn't show much. He had years of practice keeping himself steady, but inside he felt a sudden weight settle in his chest. He hadn't expected any obligation, certainly not something tying him to a family, no matter how temporary. "I'm not here to claim anything," Grant said quietly. Asha nodded, though her eyes stayed sharp. "But you are part of her survival now. That means you stand between her and those who want her." Grant took a slow breath. He hadn't asked for this, but he also couldn't walk away. Not after seeing how frightened Tali had been, how close she had come to dying in the dirt. His thoughts moved through the situation carefully. Two sisters alone in hostile territory, a wounded young woman barely able to sit up, unknown men hunting her, and a law he never intended to step into but was now standing inside. He met Asha's stare. If they come, I won't let them take her. Nomi exhaled softly, something like relief easing her posture. Asha remained still, but her gaze softened a fraction. She didn't thank him. This wasn't a moment for gratitude, but she acknowledged the truth in his voice. Tali shifted on the cot, blinking as she fought to stay awake. She looked from Grant to her sisters, confusion mixing with exhaustion. "You found me," she whispered, voice weak. Asha squeezed her hand. "We followed signs. You moved far." Grant stepped closer, careful not to crowd anyone. "You need rest. The bleeding stopped, but you're not ready to move." Tali looked at him longer this time, searching for something in his expression. Her voice trembled slightly. "You carried me." He nodded once. "You were freezing." Asha observed the exchange with a quiet intensity. She wasn't judging yet. She was measuring. Every gesture, every word, every hesitation. Apache women trusted slowly, and men like Grant, men who stayed silent about their intentions, were the hardest to read. Nomi crossed her arms and looked toward the window opening. "If the men tracking her find this cabin, they'll look for signs. We must hide our trail." Grant answered before thinking. "I'll handle outside." Asha frowned lightly. "You would help us?" "I'm not letting trouble walk in on her again," Grant said, his tone not raised but carrying a finality that left no room for argument. Asha studied him. "You knew her only one night." "Sometimes that's enough," he replied, surprising even himself with the honesty in his voice. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Tali whispered something barely audible, a confession shaped by fear and relief mixed together. "He didn't leave." Asha's expression shifted, subtle but noticeable. Nomi looked from Tali to Grant, piecing together the silent truth. Tali believed he had saved her not just physically, but in ways she hadn't known how to ask for. Grant stepped toward the door, ready to check the yard, but Asha's voice stopped him. "Cowboy," she said, her tone level but firm, "you saved her, yes. But sacred law says something more for men who stay near a cast-out woman." Grant turned slightly, waiting. Asha continued, her eyes steady. "To marry our sister by sacred law, you must please her other sisters first." Nomi's gaze flicked to Grant with a mixture of challenge and curiosity, waiting to see if he would misunderstand the word. Tali looked confused, but hopeful, as if she sensed something shifting but didn't know in which direction. Grant's chest tightened. He understood the word enough to know it carried more than one meaning, and the implications hit him harder than he expected. Asha didn't let him fill the silence. "Pleasure in our law is not touching," she clarified. "It means proving your worth, showing protection, staying through hardship, carrying weight we cannot lift, standing firm when danger comes." Nomi added quietly, "and showing you do not run." Grant stood still, jaw tightening slightly as he absorbed the expectations now placed on him. He had avoided ties for years. He had lived without belonging to anyone or anywhere. Now 3 women who had every reason to distrust him were telling him he was part of their fate. He looked at Tali, her eyes watching him with a quiet fear that he might leave now that the burden was named. She was fragile but determined, wounded yet fighting to stay conscious. Grant made a decision he didn't speak out loud. "No one's chasing you out of here," he said, voice steady. "Not while I'm standing." Asha and Nomi exchanged another long look. This time, both sisters' shoulders lowered slightly. Tali's eyes closed again, not from weakness, but from relief she didn't have the energy to express. Outside the cabin, the wind shifted again, bringing the faintest hint of distant movement. Something approaching, slow but certain. Grant stepped outside without hesitation. He wasn't part of their family yet, but whether he wanted to or not, he was already standing in the place where a man either ran or stayed. And he had chosen. Grant stepped out into the cold morning air, closing the door behind him with a careful hand so the sound wouldn't echo across the basin. Frost clung to the grass, and the thin layer of ice on the water barrel shimmered under the early sunlight. He surveyed the open ground around the cabin, noting the faint depressions in the dirt where someone had ridden past during the night. They weren't fresh enough to signal immediate danger, but they proved exactly what the sisters had feared. Someone had been searching for Tolly long before Grant arrived. He walked toward a cluster of broken shrubs and brushed his fingers across snapped branches. Whoever had taken this path moved fast, far more recklessly than hunters or scouts usually did. The tracks confirmed something the sisters hadn't said outright. Tolly's pursuers weren't a random threat. They were organized men following orders. Grant stood still for a long moment, thinking through every possibility. If they had the discipline to track across cold terrain overnight, then they would certainly try again. He checked the cabin's perimeter next, patching weak spots in the wall with broken boards he salvaged from the collapsed shed beside the cabin. He tightened the hinge on the door and moved the firewood pile closer to the entrance to keep the sisters from spending unnecessary time outside. The more he worked, the clearer his concern became. 3 women trapped in a remote location with a wounded sister placed too much pressure on a flimsy structure and too little on any form of safety. He needed to think ahead, plan routes, understand which direction danger might approach from. Grant crouched behind a boulder overlooking the lower trail, scanning the distant ridge. No riders yet, no dust trails, but the silence had a tension that unsettled him. He returned to the cabin with that unease still sitting in the back of his mind. Inside, Tolly had pushed herself halfway upright, her face pale from the effort. Asha stood beside her, holding a cup of warm broth. Nomi knelt near the fire, sorting through a small leather pouch filled with dried herbs and roots. The sisters looked up when Grant entered, their expressions a mix of caution and expectation. They were waiting to hear what he had found. Grant didn't speak immediately. He removed his coat, hung it on the nail by the door, and crouched beside the table before addressing them. "Someone passed close last night," he said, tone even. "Tracks are old enough they're not right on us, but they're looking." Asha's jaw tightened, her fear not for herself, but for Tolly. "They won't stop," she said quietly. Nomi added, "They follow orders." The man she refused embarrassed them. Grant didn't need more explanation. He had seen enough men hold grudges over wounded pride. Those men didn't want justice. They wanted control, and anyone who resisted became a target. He set his forearm against the table, thinking through every angle. He had taken in strays before, but none with a threat this organized behind them. Tolly shifted under the blanket. Her breath hitched when she moved, but she kept her eyes focused on Grant. "You could leave," she whispered. "Not your fight." Her voice carried more resignation than suggestion, as if she had already prepared herself for the possibility that he might walk away now that the danger was clearer. Grant met her weakened stare, seeing the exhaustion behind it and the fear she tried to hide. "I'm not leaving," he said simply. The words sent a quiet ripple through the room. Asha's posture changed slightly, only noticeable in how she straightened her back. Nomi stopped sorting herbs, her hands pausing midair. Even Tolly froze, holding the blanket tight against her ribs as if she needed something solid to anchor herself. Grant continued, "But if we're staying here a while, there are things I need to understand." He turned to Asha first. Why was she cast out? Asha exchanged a brief look with Nomi. They had expected the question eventually, but they had hoped Tolly would be strong enough to speak for herself. Tolly, however, stared down at her hands, unable to form the words. Asha answered instead. "The man chosen for her is older, crueler. He uses fear to keep his place in the tribe. When she refused, he claimed she disrespected sacred authority." Nomi added, "He tried to take her by force. She fought back." Grant absorbed that silently. The wound at her side told him she hadn't escaped cleanly. He glanced toward her, and her fingers tightened around the blanket again. This wasn't just exile. It was punishment meant to shame her into compliance or death. Asha leaned slightly closer to Tolly. Rejecting him in front of the council made him look weak. He sent followers to bring her back. Nomi's voice lowered. "Alive or not?" Tolly flinched, her breathing uneven. Grant kept his voice calm. "You won't be taken." Tolly raised her eyes slowly, searching his face, trying to determine whether he spoke out of duty or something more deliberate. He didn't look away. He wanted her to understand he was speaking from conviction, not pressure. Asha placed a hand on her sister's shoulder, steady but gentle. He stands between you and them now. Sacred law binds him. Grant exhaled, not from reluctance, but from the weight of what he had agreed to carry. Then I need to know what your law expects from me, he said quietly, knowing they were testing him, but also wanting clarity. Nomi spoke before Asha. That is not something spoken once. It is shown over days. Asha followed. Protection is one part, but there are other expectations. Grant waited. Nomi's gaze held curiosity. Your past matters. Men who hide their true selves fail quickly. Asha asked the question both sisters had been holding back. Who are you, Grant Hale? It wasn't a simple inquiry. It was a demand for truth. Grant stood still, weighing how much to reveal. He wasn't used to sharing his history, and the last time he had told anyone too much, it had cost him everything he cared about. But this situation didn't allow distance. These women weren't passing travelers. They were tied to him now by a law he hadn't understood until moments ago. He pulled a wooden stool toward him and Saturday. I was raised on cattle land near the river bend. My folks died early. My brother and I ran the place until a raid took him. His tone stayed steady, but the memory stiffened his shoulders. After that, I drifted, worked ranches, fixed things, stayed out of trouble mostly, never stayed anywhere long. Asha watched him with an unreadable expression. Nomi looked moved, but tried not to show it. Tali listened with quiet empathy, her eyes softening as she realized he carried losses of his own. Asha's next question was pointed. Why help a woman hunted by armed men? Grant answered honestly. Because I know what it's like to lose someone and not want another loss added to the world. The sisters absorbed his words. Something shifted then, not acceptance but acknowledgement. They saw the seriousness behind his decisions. And for the first time, none of them questioned whether he meant what he said. Tali lay back slowly, exhaustion catching up to her. Her eyes drifted closed as her body surrendered to fatigue again. Nomi covered her carefully while Asha returned to the table, preparing the herbs for poultices that would keep the wound from worsening. Grant rose to check the window again. In the distance, a faint movement flickered across the ridge, too far to identify, but enough to stir unease in his chest. He stepped outside, scanning every direction. The land stretched silent and wide, but he felt watched, the kind of sensation that didn't announce itself loudly, but whispered through the air. Behind him, Asha appeared in the doorway. They moved closer, she said, voice calm but firm. Grant didn't turn. Then we'll be ready. Asha studied the set of his shoulders, the steadiness in his stance. You stand with us, she said quietly. That matters. Grant nodded, still watching the horizon. She deserves someone who won't walk away. Asha paused, weighing his words. Then she spoke with slow certainty. Then your test begins. Grant didn't react outwardly, but he understood. Staying wasn't enough. He would need to prove, hour by hour, that he was more than a man who stumbled into their lives by accident. Inside the cabin, Tali's breathing steadied into a fragile rhythm. Nomi prepared food with fast, efficient movements. Asha stood beside Grant, watching the open land with the same resolve he carried. In the distance, a faint shadow shifted across the ridge. Danger was coming, and Grant had already chosen his place. The shadow moving across the distant ridge drew Grant's full attention, and he shifted his stance slightly to get a better angle without exposing himself. The figure disappeared behind a rock outcrop, too far to identify, but close enough to confirm what they all feared. Scouts were sweeping the basin again. He took a slow breath, steadying his thoughts. He couldn't assume they would arrive right away, but he also couldn't risk letting the sisters feel trapped without a plan. Asha stepped out fully, closing the cabin door with a quiet click so the cold wind wouldn't rush inside. She stood beside Grant with a posture that showed both worry and readiness, and her gaze followed the ridge for several beats before she spoke. They're testing the ground. They don't choose blind paths. Grant understood the warning hidden in her tone. Whoever hunted Tali wasn't searching aimlessly. They were narrowing in, looking for weak spots, trying to trace patterns in the terrain. Grant looked back toward the cabin, thinking through everything that needed to be done. Shelter alone wouldn't protect anyone if men approached from multiple angles. He turned toward Asha. Before anything else, I need to know how many might come. Asha's jaw clenched slightly. For we're sent. One carries authority. The others follow orders without question. Grant considered that silently. For men wasn't a small number, but it also wasn't an army. He could hold them off if the ground favored him, especially if he used their confidence against them. But he needed more details to build a strategy that wouldn't endanger the sisters inside. He asked, "They know this area?" Nomi opened the door and stepped outside, just in time to answer. "Not as well as us, but enough to find their way. They know she's hurt, so they think she'll stay near water or shelter." "They're right," Grant muttered under his breath, irritation rising at how predictable their situation looked from the outside. Nomi crossed her arms, her eyes darting from ridge to ridge as if reading the land's hidden signs. They've been close before. Today, they'll move lower. Grant filed every detail into a mental map. He needed to make the land work in their favor. Rocks, narrow paths, angled slopes. Anything that gave him height or cover. But there was another concern he had been avoiding, and it needed addressing before danger got closer. He faced Asha. If they take her back, what happens to her? The older sister swallowed once, her eyes flicking toward the cabin door where Tali rested. She becomes property of the man she refused. She would lose name, freedom, and voice. Nomi added in a quieter tone, "They punish women who resist." He would make example of her. Grant's jaw tightened. The cold around him felt sharper. He hadn't known the exact consequences before, but now the truth settled into his chest with heavy clarity. This wasn't a simple dispute or a family conflict. This was a hunt meant to break a woman's spirit and force her into submission. He looked at Asha again. "If I'm going to stand with you, I need to know the laws that bind you. All of them." Asha studied him for several seconds before answering. She had been waiting for him to ask that question. A man who protects a cast-out woman cannot leave her until she is safe. If he chooses to keep her, he must prove he has strength to guard her life and respect to never use her. Sisters judge if he is worthy. Grant processed her words, letting them settle into place. And if he fails? Nomi stepped closer. She returns to danger, and he loses right to claim protection. Grant absorbed that. He didn't want to fail anyone, not after losing the people who mattered most to him. He thought of Tali on the cot, her breathing weak, her voice trembling when she said he didn't leave her. That memory anchored him more firmly than any spoken law. He nodded once. "Then I won't fail." Asha didn't respond right away. She evaluated him carefully, as if trying to see through every layer he kept locked away. Whatever she found in his expression, it made her posture ease slightly. Inside the cabin, Tali stirred, and Nomi moved back to check on her. Grant followed her inside. The fire had burned low, and the room felt dim, the shadows long across the walls. Tali's eyes were open, watching the doorway with a mixture of confusion and awareness sharpened by pain. Grant approached the cot. "Someone was on the ridge," he said gently, not wanting to hide the truth. Her breathing hitched for a second, worry crossing her face, but she steadied herself. "They won't stop." Grant sat beside the cot, keeping his distance enough not to crowd her. "Then we make sure they can't take you." She looked at him, searching his face for signs of uncertainty. Finding none, she asked quietly, "Why stay? You own nothing." He wasn't prepared for the question, not in the raw way she asked it. He looked at her bandaged side, then into her eyes. "You didn't deserve what they did. And I don't walk away from people who need help." Tali's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue or question further, but her strength wasn't ready for that. She closed her eyes briefly, composing herself. Asha stepped inside, bringing the leather pouch Nomi had left near the fire. She set it on the table and started mixing a new blend of crushed herbs. The scent filled the room, earthy and sharp. Nomi returned with a water pail. "She needs food too. Real food." Grant stood. "I'll hunt," he said without hesitation. Asha turned toward him with a warning in her voice. "They search for movement. Riding now is dangerous." Grant grabbed his coat from a nail. "Walking's quieter." Nomi watched him tie the holster tighter around his belt. "What will you bring?" she asked. "Something small," Grant answered. "Enough to keep her strength up." Tali opened her eyes again. "Be careful," she whispered. Grant held her gaze for one long moment. His voice came out low, steady. "I will." He stepped outside with purposeful strides, the cold air wrapping around him like a reminder of what was at stake. The sisters watched him through the doorway, each registering the way he scanned the terrain with the instincts of a man who had spent years surviving on the edges of danger. They saw how he adjusted his pace, how he checked the sky, how he left almost no trace in the frost. He disappeared behind a row of pines. Back inside, Tali whispered to Asha. He didn't ask for reward. Asha answered quietly, "Some men don't seek gain. Some just stand where they're needed." Nomi added, "He carries grief. You can see it." Tali touched the blanket lightly, her fingers trembling. "He carries himself like someone who lost too much." They didn't answer. They didn't have to. Outside, Grant crouched near a cluster of rabbit tracks, listening to the faint rustle of movement in the brush. His mind shifted between the hunt and the cabin, calculating danger, thinking through routes of escape, weighing how long they could stay in the cabin before moving. He caught the rabbit quickly, cleanly, without firing a shot. Noise would draw attention. Silence kept them alive. As he began the walk back, he paused near a ridge and scanned the basin again. A flicker of movement near the far edge caught his eye, closer now than before. They were coming, and Grant quickened his pace, not in fear, but in recognition that everything he did from this moment forward would determine whether Tali survived the next sunrise. Grant moved quickly down the slope with the rabbit tied to his belt, the cold air cutting across his face as he approached the cabin. His boots pressed lightly into the frost, each step controlled so he wouldn't leave a clear trail. He paused one last time before descending fully, scanning the ridge where he had seen movement earlier. The faint silhouette was gone, but the unease it left behind stayed sharp in his chest. Whoever hunted Tali was closing the distance, and they wouldn't stop until they either found her or were forced to turn back. He reached the cabin door and knocked softly so he wouldn't startle the sisters. Asha opened it halfway, her expression tense until she confirmed it was him. She stepped aside. Grant entered and hung his coat by the nail, the rabbit already cleaned and ready for cooking. The warmth of the fire hit him immediately, carrying the scent of simmering herbs that Nomi had boiled moments earlier. Tali lay on her side, awake but visibly exhausted. Her breathing was calmer, though each inhale took effort. Grant set the rabbit on the table, and Nomi took it quickly, starting to prepare it with efficient movements, her small hands working with practiced speed. Asha approached Grant quietly. "Did you see more?" Grant nodded once. Someone was closer. Not close enough to strike, but close enough to know they're narrowing in. Asha's expression hardened. "They'll reach the basin by sundown." Nomi's knife paused mid-cut. "Do they know this cabin exists?" "Maybe not," Grant replied. "But they know she's too hurt to travel far. They'll look for smoke, tracks, anything that stands out." He didn't say the next part, but it hung heavy in the air. If they were skilled trackers, it was only a matter of time before they found the shelter. Tali shifted on the cot, holding the blanket to her ribs. "If you run now, they won't chase you," she said in a strained whisper, the words coming from fear for him rather than for herself. Grant turned toward her, the firelight casting a soft glow across her face. "I told you I'm not leaving." Tali's eyes lingered on him, searching for weakness, but she found none. Asha stepped closer to her sister and rested a hand on her shoulder. "He means it," she said. "He stood outside all morning without rest." Nomi carried the rabbit pieces toward the pot and added them carefully. "Food will help her walk sooner," she said. "If she walks, we can move." That unresolved question, where they would go, sat unspoken between them. Grant finally addressed it. "There's a rock shelter farther north. Hidden, narrow, good for staying quiet. If we need to move, that's the safest direction." Asha nodded thoughtfully. "Would you lead us?" "Yeah," Grant answered, "but not with her in this condition." He looked at Tali again. "You push too hard. You'll bleed again. We need to keep you steady." Tali closed her eyes briefly. accepting the truth she didn't like. Nomi stirred the pot. Then we protect this place for now. Asha turned to Grant with a serious look. You said you need to understand our laws. We also need to understand yours. Grant raised an eyebrow. What do you need to know? Asha crossed her arms, studying him. Where do you stand with women? Do you seek to claim them? Use them? Leave them? Grant pushed a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the question. I don't take what isn't offered. I don't touch without consent. I don't promise anything I won't stand by. Nomi watched his face closely. Do you want her? She asked, not teasing but testing. Tali's eyes widened slightly, her breath catching. The room went still. Grant answered slowly, choosing words with honesty rather than haste. I don't know what the future holds, but I don't see her as something to possess. I see someone who deserved better than what happened to her. Tali swallowed hard, emotion flickering behind her guarded expression. Asha nodded once, reading his tone carefully, weighing it. His answers mattered because trust mattered, and sacred law required clarity from a man before letting him anywhere near a cast-out woman. Asha stepped away from the cot and pointed to the door. Come with me. Grant followed her outside, leaving Nomi to tend the pot and Tali to rest. The morning had warmed slightly, melting thin patches of frost. Asha walked toward a flat boulder overlooking the basin and stood with her arms crossed. Our law says a man must prove he can carry the weight of danger, she said. Words are easy. Actions are truth. Grant kept his eyes on a ridge. Tell me what you need. Asha gestured toward the ground behind the cabin. My father taught us to build signals, quiet signs that only family can read. If we set them around the cabin, we'll know when riders pass. She stepped closer, her expression firm. You help build them. Then I'll know if your intentions are real. Grant nodded. Show me. For the next stretch of time, Asha taught him how to place small markers. Tiny stacks of stones arranged in ways outsiders wouldn't notice. Small sticks bent in precise angles pointing toward trails, and lines drawn lightly with char that blended with dead grass. They circled the cabin, marking spots where a hoofprint or a broken branch would be easiest to read. As they worked, Asha spoke quietly, revealing information she had kept close until now. You asked before why Tali was cast out. What she didn't tell you is that the man she refused has influence over the council. He wanted her because she is skilled and because she is beautiful. Grant listened without responding. Asha continued. He took offense when she refused. He claimed she insulted sacred authority. He asked that she be marked as cast out. Grant crouched to place a stone marker, his expression darkening as he processed the cruelty behind the decision. Asha added, she didn't run to save herself. She ran so he would not punish us too. Grant turned toward her. Would he have? Asha's eyes hardened. Yes. Men like him punish families to break women who resist. Grant stood slowly, the realization settling deep inside him. Tali hadn't been fleeing just for her life. She had been fleeing to protect the sisters standing beside him. They returned to the cabin as the rabbit finished cooking. Nomi ladled broth into a wooden bowl and brought it to Tali, who lifted herself with Asha's help. Tali sipped slowly, the warmth easing the tightness in her face. Grant sat nearby, keeping watch on the window. He noticed Tali's eyes drifting toward him repeatedly, hesitant but intentional. Something in her expression had shifted, a mixture of gratitude, fear, and a question she wasn't ready to voice. Nomi noticed too. She leaned closer to her sister and whispered something in their own language. Tali gave a small shake of her head, embarrassed, but Nomi only smiled faintly and handed her more broth. Grant pretended not to notice, though his chest tightened with a feeling he tried to push aside. Suddenly Asha froze near the door, her hand hovering above the latch. Grant caught the movement instantly. What is it? He asked. Asha pointed toward the rock they had marked earlier, visible just beyond the window. A small stone had shifted from its precise angle, just enough to signal disturbance. Nomi's breath hitched. Someone passed behind the cabin. Grant's voice dropped to a quiet, firm tone. They're closer than we thought. Tali gripped the blanket tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Asha moved beside her, steady and protective. Grant placed a hand on the wall, grounding himself, thinking fast. The search party had reached the outer perimeter. Time was running out, and now every move they made would determine whether Tali lived long enough to choose her own fate. The shifted stone marker tightened Grant's nerves in a way that left no doubt. Someone had crossed behind the cabin, close enough to study the walls, but cautious enough not to announce their presence. Grant stepped away from the window and grabbed his coat, sliding it on with calm, measured movements. Asha followed him with her eyes, interpreting his every gesture, seeing how the quiet man's instincts sharpened when danger pressed near. Nomi, though trying to appear composed, hovered near Tali with a worry she could no longer hide. Tali struggled to lift herself slightly, her breath thin. "How many?" she whispered. Grant shook his head. "Only signs. No faces yet." He didn't want to add more fear to her weakened state, but the truth was clear. The hunters were testing the perimeter, searching for clues before committing to a full approach. Asha's voice lowered. "These men move like animals. They don't strike until they smell certainty." Nomi closed the shutters with a quiet push. "What do we do?" she asked, her tone a fragile mix of fear and practicality. Grant scanned the cabin interior, realizing something essential needed addressing if they were going to defend themselves effectively. They couldn't simply hide and hope the scouts moved on. They needed to know who they were dealing with, what they wanted, how far they were willing to go. He crouched near the hearth and spoke calmly. "I need to see them before they see us clearly. If I can track who came near the cabin, I'll know their direction, their pace, maybe even how long before they strike." Asha stepped closer, her posture firm. "You will not face them alone." Grant glanced at her. "If we all go out there, they'll see movement from far off. I'm just one man in a coat. They'll assume I'm a rancher passing through." Asha hesitated. She didn't like the idea, but she understood. Nomi touched her sister's arm gently, trying to reassure her. "He knows the land as well as we do," she said quietly. "Let him read the signs." Grant gave her a brief nod before grabbing the rifle he'd leaned beside the wall earlier. He paused at the door and addressed the question none of them had voiced yet. If they entered the area behind the cabin, they might be circling. I need to know if they split into separate groups. Tali's expression tightened. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice thin but steady. Her fingers curled around the blanket, as though steadying herself against the fear she couldn't hide. Grant met her gaze for a moment. Something quiet passed between them, an understanding that his decision wasn't just strategy, but also a promise. Then he stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. The cold air met him immediately, sharper now that the sun had dipped low behind the hills. He walked with controlled pace toward the rear of the cabin, keeping his body angled so shadows hid most of his form. The ground bore faint indentations from a single rider. Grant crouched to examine them, tracing the outline with the tip of his glove. The horse had paused and shifted weight. Whoever rode it had stopped to watch the cabin. He moved farther into the brush, following the tracks until they split into a second set, lighter and more erratic. One rider had gone left. The other had gone right. They were circling deliberately. Grant's chest tightened with a realization. These weren't scouts hoping to locate shelter. These were men trained to corner prey from multiple sides. He straightened with his jaw set, his thoughts racing through possible outcomes. A direct attack would come only when they had perfect advantage. He needed to buy the sisters time to gather strength, time to move, time to survive. He returned toward the cabin, but stopped at the creek that ran behind the rocks. Something caught his eye, an object lodged between stones near the waterline. He approached with cautious steps and pulled it free. A broken piece of beadwork, not one belonging to Tali. This one was made with coarse cord and colors that didn't match the sisters' traditional patterns. It meant the pursuers were closer than expected. One of them had dismounted near the creek, maybe to drink, maybe to listen. Grant pocketed the bead fragment and continued toward the cabin, unraveling new questions. Why would a council send only 4 men to drag a woman back? Why send experienced trackers instead of younger warriors? Why strike during colder months when travel was harsh? The sisters had explained the shame Tali had brought upon the man she refused, but Grant sensed there was something deeper, something none of them had spoken aloud. Inside the cabin, the fire burned brighter as Nomi fed its small sticks. Tali sat upright now, with Asha's help, wincing as she shifted. Their eyes all turned to Grant the moment he entered. Asha asked in a low voice, "What did you see?" Grant set the bead fragment on the table. Nomi leaned close, her face paling. "That's not ours." Grant nodded. "They're circling from both sides. At least 2 riders now. Maybe more if they regrouped." Tali's breath tightened. "They'll drag me back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll punish my sisters for helping me." Grant stepped closer, lowering himself beside the cot so she could see his face clearly. "No one's taking you," he said softly. "Not while I'm breathing." She stared at him, searching for cracks in his confidence. She found none. Something in her expression shifted. Fear didn't fade, but trust took its place beside it, fragile yet forming. Asha sat beside the table, thinking deeply. These men move carefully. They don't risk open fights. They wait for weakness. Grant picked up the bead fragment and turned it over in his hand. "They're not here for mercy. Whoever sent them wants to make an example, not retrieve a woman peacefully." He glanced at Asha. "You didn't tell me everything." Asha's eyes hardened. "There are things we hoped you would not need to know." Nomi spoke quietly from the fire. "The man she refused, he is not just older. He holds a position over warriors. He wants to replace our father's voice in council. Bringing her back gives him leverage." Grant processed the implications quickly. "So taking her isn't only punishment, it's political." Asha nodded reluctantly. "If she submits, he claims our family, our lands, our rights. If she dies, he claims justification." Tali trembled, her face twisting with pain and shame. "I ran so they wouldn't be hurt," she whispered. "But they still came after me." Grant reached for the blanket edge and adjusted it gently around her shoulders. His touch was careful, respectful. "Running didn't place blame on you," he said. "His cruelty did." Nomi's eyes glistened slightly, though she hid it by turning back to the pot. "What do we do now?" she asked. Grant stood, his voice steady and decisive. "We prepare. They won't rush until they believe we're vulnerable. So we make sure we're not." Asha stepped forward. "Tell us how." Grant examined the cabin walls, studying the sight lines through the cracks between logs. "They'll watch the front first. We'll reinforce the windows with crates. Nomi, block the back entrance with the extra boards. Asha, help me place brush near the trail so we can hear them before they reach the ridge." Tali watched silently, her eyes following every movement, relief mixing with awe. Grant moved with precision, planning each detail as if he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. He wasn't simply helping. He was taking responsibility. As Asha moved to gather wood, Grant pulled her aside briefly. "If things go bad, I'll lead them away," he said under his breath. "You get your sisters to safety." Asha stiffened. "You would sacrifice yourself?" Grant didn't flinch. "If it means she lives, yes." Asha held his gaze, evaluating him as she had many times before. But this time, something changed behind her eyes. Recognition, acceptance, respect. "If you fight," she said quietly, "we fight too." Nomi returned with boards, and the 3 of them began reinforcing the cabin while Tali rested against the cot, watching the quiet determination Grant carried in every movement. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of distant hooves. Grant paused, listening with sharpened focus. The pursuers weren't testing anymore. They were closing in. The faint rhythm of hooves rolling across distant stone tightened the air inside the cabin, and Grant motioned for Asha and Nomi to move silently to their stations. Every sound mattered now: breathing, footsteps, the crackle of the fire. He pressed his ear to the front wall, listening for the second set of hooves he expected. When he heard them, lighter, quicker, weaving behind the ridge, he knew the riders had split to flank the cabin from 2 angles. Asha went to Tali immediately, lowering her voice. "Don't sit up too fast. Breathe slow." Tali obeyed, though her trembling hands showed she was fighting the urge to panic. Fear flickered across her face. Not only fear of being taken back, but fear that her presence was endangering the people she loved. Grant knew this without her saying it. He turned to Nomi. Did you finish the backboards? She nodded. It's sealed. They'll need time to break through it. Grant pulled the lantern wick down until only a dull orange glow lit the center of the room. Darkness hid weakness. Light revealed it. He needed the cabin shadows to work in their favor. Then he noticed something Nomi had overlooked: the sisters' horses tied behind the cabin. If the riders spotted them, they'd know the cabin was occupied by more than one person. Grant stepped toward the back and whispered, I'm moving the horses. Asha grabbed his arm before he reached the door. If they see you, they won't, he said, gently pulling free. He slipped out quietly, closing the door behind him, and immediately ducked behind the stacked brush. The cold air bit his cheeks as he scanned the basin. 3 silhouettes now crept along the ridge, moving with slow, methodical precision. They weren't charging. They were studying the land, waiting for something to reveal itself. Grant untied the horses quietly, looping the reins through his hand as he led them deeper behind the rocks where they wouldn't be noticed. He whispered directions to them, tapping their necks to guide them wordlessly. When they were sheltered, he froze again. One of the riders turned his head toward the cabin, as if sensing movement. Grant held still long enough for his breath to fade. Only when the rider shifted back did he move again, returning to the cabin with swift, controlled steps. Inside, Asha met him with visible relief. Nomi exhaled sharply. Tali looked at him like she was afraid he wouldn't return. Grant pulled the rifle from the corner and pointed toward the roof. I'm going up. Nomi blinked. Why the roof? Grant explained quietly. They'll expect me at the windows. They think I'll defend from inside. They won't think I'll take the high ground. Asha hesitated but nodded. Go. Grant slipped through the narrow gap between the crates and the wall, pushing open the small hatch that miners had once used to access the roof. He climbed out carefully, keeping his body low as he moved across the cold shingles. The wind cut over the ridge, carrying dust and brittle air, but the vantage point gave him something invaluable: sight. He saw them clearly now. 3 riders to the north, moving in a line, watching the land below. One to the west, dismounted, crouched near the spot where Tali had collapsed days earlier. He was older, broader, with a posture that hinted at authority. His coat bore a strip of dyed hide, something tribal leaders sometimes wore when acting outside council approval. Grant understood something then. The man wasn't hunting for the tribe. He was hunting for himself. Personal vengeance, personal power. The sisters had hinted at this, but now the truth was plain. This wasn't about restoring order. This was about a man preserving pride. Grant slid lower on the roof and quietly counted their spacing, their formations, their angles of approach. They weren't rushing the cabin. They were waiting for night. Under cover of darkness, they'd strike, hoping to drag Tali away before anyone could fight back. He climbed back down and sealed the hatch silently. Inside, Tali sat propped up, her breathing shallow but steadier than before. Her gaze locked onto Grant's as soon as he re-entered the room. How many? She whispered. 4, he said. 3 mounted, 1 on foot. Asha muttered something under her breath, anger sharpening her voice. He came himself. Tali's lips tightened into a thin line of fear. Grant moved closer. The 1 on foot. Is he the man you refused? Tali's eyes softened with dread. Slowly, she nodded. Grant absorbed the truth. This was the man who wanted control so badly he would break sacred laws to get it. He wasn't simply reclaiming a future wife. He was reclaiming authority by force. Grant crouched beside Tali, speaking in a steady tone meant to anchor her. He won't touch you. Not while I'm here. Tali looked down, her fingers twisting the blanket edges. He's powerful. He commands others. Grant's voice lowered. He's still a man, and men like him break when they meet someone they can't scare. Asha stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. Our father always said, fear dies when someone stands without shaking. Nomi added, you don't shake. Grant glanced at her. I just don't leave. Asha looked toward the blocked windows. How long until they strike? Grant answered, they'll wait for night. Nomi frowned. Why not now? Grant pointed to the walls. They don't know what's inside. They want darkness to hide their mistakes. Asha began gathering supplies, stacking extra firewood near the hearth, moving tools into reachable positions. We prepare then. Grant stood, thinking through their options. They couldn't wait inside forever. They needed to survive the first push and then move north before dawn, toward the shelter he knew. He turned toward Tali. How much can you walk? Tali tested her legs beneath the blanket, wincing as pain shot through her ribs. A little, she whispered. Not far. Nomi fetched a narrow leather belt from her pouch. This tightens her ribs, keeps them stable when she moves. Grant helped them wrap it gently around Tali, careful not to touch anything without warning her first. She watched him, confused by how he avoided any gesture that might frighten her, how he moved with restraint even when he needed to move fast. Asha noticed too. She spoke softly. He respects you. Tali looked at him again, emotion stirring under her tired features. I don't understand why. Grant picked up the rifle and checked its chamber. You deserved safety long before I found you, he said simply. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind dropped suddenly, leaving a tension so dense it felt unnatural. A distant owl called once, then fell silent. Grant paused mid-step, sensing something shift. Asha stiffened. What is it? Grant answered in a low, controlled voice. They stopped moving. Nomi whispered why. Grant chambered around with silent precision. Because they're waiting for darkness. The last sliver of daylight melted behind the ridge, casting the cabin into deep shadow. And Grant positioned himself between the door and the women, ready for the moment the hunt would finally break open. Night settled over the basin with a heaviness that felt deliberate, as if the darkness itself were siding with the hunters waiting beyond the ridge. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its embers casting faint orange light across the room. Grant positioned himself by the door, rifle held loosely but ready, his ears tuned to the smallest sound outside. Asha stood near the rear wall, holding a long wooden spear she had crafted earlier from a broken tool handle. Nomi knelt beside Tali, tightening the leather rib support one last time before slipping a small sharpened bone knife under her sister's blanket in case the worst happened. Tali clutched it with trembling fingers, her eyes focused and more awake than the pain should have allowed. Grant took a slow breath, reviewing everything in his mind. The cabin had only one true entrance now that the backboards were reinforced. The windows were blocked, leaving narrow slits for sight, but no room for arrows or bullets to slip through. The signal stones had already warned them of the rider's approach. The next warning would be the ground itself. A quiet crunch of gravel broke the silence. Asha moved closer to Tali. They're near, she whispered, her stance ready. Grant motioned for everyone to stay still. The crunch came again, slower, controlled, intentional. Whoever approached was not charging, but testing the distance, trying to draw someone out. Nomi whispered, why don't they attack? They want us to panic, Grant said. If we open the door, they strike fast. If we stay quiet, they wait for the weakest moment. A sudden thud hit the back wall. Tali gasped and gripped Nomi's arm. Asha's spear angled upward, her focus sharp. Grant didn't move, keeping his rifle aimed at the door while his mind calculated quickly. The thud wasn't an attack. There was no cracking wood or sharp blow. It sounded more like something being dropped against the wall. Asha frowned. What was that? Grant moved toward the rear, keeping low, and pressed his ear to the planks. Another soft thud echoed, followed by a low scraping. He stepped back, realizing what they were doing. They're marking the cabin, he said, putting signs for the others to follow. They split, Nomi murmured. Half by the ridge, half behind us. Grant returned to the front door. They're mapping the perimeter before the strike. Tali whispered, fear thick in her voice. Can we outrun them? Grant shook his head. Not tonight. Not with your wound. Asha steadied Tali again. Then we stand. Grant watched them, noticing something that had been left unspoken since the beginning. The sisters had never asked what Grant expected in return for protecting them. They hadn't offered food, supplies, or safety. They had only watched him, tested him, and waited to see who he truly was. Now, in the face of danger closing in, that mattered more than any sacred rule. A distant whistle cut the air. Grant stiffened. They're signaling each other. Nomi's voice trembled. That sound means they move as one. Grant moved to the narrow slit at the window and studied the dark shapes forming near the ridge. The dismounted man, the one Tali refused, stood at the center, flanked by two riders on foot, their horses tied behind a cluster of scrub. They positioned themselves in a loose half-circle, staring down at the cabin with unsettling patience. "What do they want with her now?" Grant murmured, speaking to Asha without dragging attention to Tali. Asha joined him at the slit, peering out carefully. "He wants her shamed," she said. "If he drags her back wounded, he shows counsel she cannot survive alone, that she must submit to him." Nomi added from behind them. "And if he kills you, he shows he can beat any man who stand against him." Grant felt a cold knot form in his chest. The hunters weren't just reclaiming someone. They were building a display of dominance. Another whistle came, 2 short bursts, followed by a long one. Asha's eyes widened. "That's the call for advance." Grant raised his rifle. "They're coming." Hoofbeats rolled across the ground, slow at first, then gaining speed. A single rider moved directly toward the front door, while the others circled wide to flank both sides. The ground shook faintly under the pressure of hooves. Nomi grabbed Tali's arm, positioning herself between her sister and the door. Asha braced the spear at an angle, ready but not reckless. Grant whispered, "No one opens the door. Let them come to us." The rider slowed 20 feet from the cabin and spoke with a voice dripping with authority. "Bring her out." Tali's breath caught. Asha's grip tightened around the spear. Grant didn't respond. The voice came louder this time. "She belongs to the council. Keep her inside, and I take all of you with her." Grant stepped forward, letting his voice carry with steady resolve. "She's not going anywhere." Silence followed. Heavy, loaded. Then came a sharp, angry laugh from outside. "You think you can hide her forever? You think you can fight for a woman cast out by her own blood?" Grant didn't flinch. "She chose dignity. You chose cruelty." A sudden clatter of rocks rolled down the northern slope. Another rider dismounting. Footsteps approached the window. A dark shape moved past the slit, attempting to peek inside. Grant fired a single round upward, hitting the roof beam near the man's head on purpose. Wood splintered, sending shards flying into the night. The man stumbled back with a startled shout. Asha stared at Grant in shock. "You warned him." Grant reloaded with steady hands. "I don't kill unless I must." Tali watched him with a mixture of awe and emotion she didn't dare name. No man had ever risked himself for her without asking for her body, her loyalty, or her submission. Grant risked himself because he couldn't stand the idea of her suffering. That realization shook her deeply. Outside, the riders regrouped briefly. Grant recognized this pause for what it was, not hesitation, but organization. They were adjusting their approach. He whispered to Asha, "They'll try the roof next." Asha nodded, moving toward the back wall. Nomi held Tali tightly. "If they break through." "They won't," Grant said, voice firm. Just when it seemed the hunters were preparing to strike again, a sudden flicker of light appeared on the ridge. A torch. A second torch flared beside it, brighter than the first. Asha inhaled sharply. "That's not them." Grant's brow furrowed. "Then who?" The horses outside began to snort and shuffle nervously, reacting to whatever approached. The torchlight grew stronger, moving down the slope in a quick, purposeful descent. Nomi whispered, "Someone else is coming." Asha's eyes widened slowly as realization dawned. "Wait, that's our father's signal." Tali gasped, her voice breaking. "He came for us." Grant lowered his rifle slightly, the realization settling in with unexpected force. The man Tali's pursuer feared most wasn't the cowboy standing in the cabin. It was the one walking down the ridge with 2 torches blazing like a warning. And he wasn't coming to reclaim Tali. He was coming to confront the man who tried to destroy his daughter's life. The twin torches moved steadily down the ridge, their lights spreading across the basin in 2 bright arcs that cut through the darkness. The riders who had been circling the cabin stiffened immediately, stepping back from their positions as the man, holding both torches, approached with calm, measured steps. Grant recognized hesitation in their movements, the kind that came from seeing someone they weren't prepared to face. Asha pushed the door open just enough to see clearly, her eyes widening with disbelief that gave way to relief. "It's him," she whispered, voice trembling. He came in person. A tall, broad-shouldered man strode across the clearing, his coat trimmed with beadwork that marked him as someone of high standing. His face was stern, his posture unwavering, and every step he took radiated authority earned through years of leadership. When he reached the ground below the cabin, he planted both torches in the earth, letting their flames burn tall against the night. The pursuer, the older man Tali had refused, stepped out from the shadows with two of his followers behind him. His arrogance faltered beneath the glow of the torches. "You are not summoned," he said sharply. "This matter is mine to settle." Tali's father tilted his head, his expression unshaken. "You misuse the council's name," he said, his tone quiet but sharp. "You act without their blessing. You shame yourself." The pursuer's jaw clenched. She defied a sacred choice. Tali's father took one step closer. "A choice forced is not sacred." Grant watched the exchange through the narrow opening, noticing how the pursuer's followers shifted uncomfortably, their certainty shaken by the presence of a man who held true authority. The pursuer, however, refused to bend. He pointed toward the cabin, his face contorted with anger. "The woman belongs to our law. That man inside interferes in tribal matters." Tali's father raised a hand, silencing him. "The man inside saved her life. That grants him right to stand by her until she is safe." His voice carried across the clearing with a weight that demanded obedience. "And safe does not mean taken by force." One of the followers murmured quietly. Council did not approve her capture. The pursuer spun toward his own men, fury bristling through him. "She humiliated me. I will not let the council override my claim." Tali's father looked at him with cold clarity. "Your claim was never granted. You sought to bend the law for your pride." Inside the cabin, Tali trembled. Asha held her hand. Nomi stood beside her protectively. Grant stayed near the door, ready to intervene if needed, but understanding that this confrontation now belonged to her family. Outside, the pursuer stepped forward, his voice rising. "She belongs to me." Tali's father moved faster than expected for a man of his age. He closed the distance with sudden force, his hand gripping the front of the pursuer's coat. "She belongs to no man," he hissed. "Not you. Not anyone." He shoved him backward, forcing him to stagger. The followers watched in silence, torn between loyalty and shame. The pursuer regained his footing and drew a knife, the blade flashing in the torchlight. Gasps rose from the watchers on the ridge. Grant reached for the door, ready to rush out, but Asha placed a firm hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "No," she whispered. "He must face this." Tali's father did not draw a weapon. He stood perfectly still, waiting. When the pursuer lunged, he sidestepped with practiced calm, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting sharply until the knife fell to the ground. The pursuer cried out, collapsing to one knee. "You dishonor our people," Tali's father said. "You used fear to take what was not offered. You hunted a woman you had no right to claim." The pursuer spat on the dirt. "She shamed me." Tali's father spoke with quiet finality. "A man is not shamed by a woman's choice. He is shamed by his own cruelty." Slowly, he released the man's arm and stepped back. He addressed the other riders. "Take him home. He will face council judgment." The two followers hesitated, then grabbed their leader by the arms and dragged him backward toward the horses, ignoring his shouts and curses. His power evaporated with every step they took, disappearing into the darkness beyond the ridge. Only when the riders were gone did Tali's father turn toward the cabin. Grant opened the door, lowering his rifle. Asha and Nomi stepped aside as Tali's father entered, his stern gaze softening the moment he saw his daughter. "Tali," he said, voice breaking. Tali's lips trembled. She tried to stand, but winced from the pain. He went to her quickly, kneeling beside the cot. "You should never have suffered for refusing him," he said. "I should have intervened sooner." Tali leaned against him carefully, tears slipping down her cheeks. I was alone." He shook his head firmly. "Never." Asha placed a hand on her father's shoulder, Nomi leaned close, relief easing years of quiet worry from her face. Then Tali's father looked up at Grant. His gaze traveled across the room, taking in the reinforced walls, the blocked windows, the careful arrangement of supplies and tools. He understood instantly what Grant had done. "You protected her," he said. Grant nodded once. "She needed someone." The father stood, facing him with the weight of gratitude and responsibility. "Our law grants you right to remain by her side if you choose." Grant glanced at Tali, whose eyes watched him with something tender and hopeful beneath the exhaustion. "I choose to stay," he said quietly. Tali's father studied him for several seconds, testing the strength in Grant's voice, searching for any sign of hesitation. He found none. "Then you are welcomed," he said. Nomi smiled warmly. Asha gave a rare small nod of approval. Tali's lips curved into the faintest smile, her eyes softening as she exhaled a breath she had been holding for days. Her father turned toward the door. "We will take you home. All of you." Grant helped Tali stand for the first time since he found her. She leaned against him carefully, her hand resting on his arm, steadying herself. He supported her without crowding her, moving with a gentleness she had never known from any man outside her family. Once outside, the torches still burned, lighting the path ahead. Tali looked at Grant, whispering, "You stayed." Grant met her eyes, his voice steady. "I'm not done staying." Asha and Nomi walked ahead with their father, guiding the way toward their tribal home, a place Tali could return to without fear, without shame, and without the weight of a forced future. Grant and Tali followed behind, each step slow but certain. No danger remained. No unanswered questions hung in the air. They moved forward together, and for the first time since fate crossed their paths, the world around them felt safe enough to build something new, something chosen, earned, and protected. Together.